All right, here we go. Yo, everybody. So, this is the Mind Body Marathon podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Leo. And on this show, we're going to talk about training theory and different things with running training. And on this show, we have none other than Matt Woods, who was my coach just after college and all the way through to about 2013,
Yes.
somewhere in there, just after the Olympic trials for the 2012 trials. And so this is going to be a great episode for me. It's going to be a great episode for anybody looking for highly technical things for training for running. Matt is he is an absolute reservoir of knowledge with regards to running training theory. We're going to get into the weeds today. We're going to talk about some great topics. We're going to talk about some trending training theories. We're going to talk about a lot of the old school training theories and kind of how to sort of blend everything together and make your training more functional and efficient. So, but yeah, so Matt, so fill me in kind of on why you got started with coaching in the first place and kind of your road with that.
First of all, I want to thank you, Leo, for having me and giving me an opportunity to speak to the running community. And as far as my coaching history, from my earliest running days, I mean, I've been in the sport for about 43 years, actually.
Oh, geez.
And
I'm almost 42.
I really didn't have a really good coach when I first started. So
Yeah.
out of necessity, I kind of had to be my own coach. And then my brother, 2.5 years younger than me, I was kind of his major coaching influence. And basically ever since that time,
Yeah.
I've always been looking for coaching opportunities, both formal and informal. So, I knew kind of early on that I almost liked coaching more than running and racing myself.
Why do you think that was?
Well, there's a lot less nerves
Yeah.
involved. I mean, I get
like,
nervous before, my athletes' races, but
yeah.
I just like I like being on the sidelines and yelling for the athletes,
Yeah.
and coming up with the formula and the prescription, and
Yeah.
kind of guiding the ship, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And that you do it well. I know whenever I was racing, I always could, I mean, it's like the cocktail effect. It's like that psychological thing where you can hear people's voices in the crowd amongst a lot of other people. And I always knew your voice, but you always said the most like perfect thing at the right time just to get me going. Like whether it's not, you could sense if my energy was too high, like to cool it off, or if my energy was too low to like pick it up, like you always kind of said the right thing at the right time. Yeah. And so it sounds like you've always kind of had that sense for your athletes.
Yeah, I mean, the pre-race psychology and just, you know, being able to almost be in the moment with the athlete and just help them through it.
Yeah.
Kind of walk them through it, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. So walk me through so you got a master's from Eastern Michigan, was it?
Yes. Yes.
And then, so who would you say is your most influential person in the sport, like whether it be coach or athlete or somebody who really you've sort of latched onto from a technical perspective?
Well, I've been heavily influenced by Renato Canova.
Yeah.
I mean, Lydiard undoubtedly had a big influence. Jack Daniels, Joe Vigil, Jack Hazen, our college coach. He exposed us to a lot of things that I don't think we would have necessarily been exposed to otherwise. Yeah. But I've always been a student of the sport, and I absorb anything and everything that I could find. When the internet came about, that opened up a whole new realm of information. I mean, I have probably every running book that has basically ever been written, and I just
quite literally
absorbed that stuff and formulated my own philosophy over time, and found out what I felt worked and what was most effective, and kind of discarded the stuff that I thought really wasn't useful.
Yeah, I remember when I think this was 2006 when we were out at Mammoth Lakes, and you came out. Was it 06? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you had a meeting with V Hill. You were just hanging out with him at Starbucks, right? You and him were just there.
Irv Ray.
And Irv Ray was there too. And I remember after that meeting, they went over to Hayes and was like, "You absolutely have to use this guy. He knows what he's talking about." And so that had to be quite an honor to kind of one of your mentors to say that about you.
Yeah, I mean, those were great conversations.
Yeah,
and I was on top of the world. I mean, I just felt, it was exciting to be amongst, celebrity coaches.
Yeah.
And be able to impress upon them my knowledge and get their feedback and just have those conversations with them.
So you mentioned earlier your general concept of training. How would you categorize that?
Well, I came up with a concept that I call Total Progressive Aerobic Development. It's called TPAD, which is just basically a systematic layering of aerobic elements, gradually increasing the intensity over the course of the training period.
Yeah.
In a periodized fashion, and layering successively more intense aerobic intensity. And it's a volume-based approach. I don't think you can be successful as an elite athlete, particularly on the male side, unless you're doing 85 to 100 miles a week.
Yeah.
I think that anybody who's getting by on low mileage, they're either injury prone or they would be doing even better with more mileage.
Yeah.
Whether it's substituted through cross training or other alternative means.
Okay, so let's pick that apart a little bit. So what are some of the first components that you'll lead with? And what'd you call it? The TPAC?
TPAD.
Yeah.
Total Progressive Aerobic Development.
Okay,
TPAD. An acronym that I came up with. And
I think that's cool. I've not heard that from you before.
And I gave some clinics or presentations at the Malone Cross Country Camp using kind of that formula. But I think that the general aerobic foundation of easy aerobic running, what they're calling zone 2 type intensity is the foundation. Then you would go to, I consider it aerobic threshold. It's basically a marathon pace.
Okay.
It's kind of the first tempo or threshold intensity. And then anaerobic threshold, which is, kind of your classic half marathon, 1 hour race pace type intensity. And then, limited amounts of VO2 max type work, and even more limited amounts of purely anaerobic training. The long run, I think, is a component that is essential to basically all distance running training. And you put the ancillary elements on top of that, whether it be running specific strength training or corrective exercises, these types of things.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that always fascinated me about you is being able to figure out like where to start with an athlete with regards to volume and race pace. I remember right before training for Chicago in 2006, we did the 5 mile repeats on the track.
Yes.
And then we measured the lactate in between each. What was that called? Like, what did you call it?
It was a lactate profile.
Lactate profile.
We basically kind of honed in on the range of paces that we thought were possible for your marathon debut. And we got kind of current lactate levels on those paces within about a 5 to 10 second range.
Yeah.
So like, your goal was to run essentially 220. 520 pace. So I think we started maybe at, 5:30, 5:35, and then broke it down by 5-second increments. And we were looking for a stabilization of the lactate level, knowing that if the lactate was too high on any of those paces, that it definitely wasn't going to be sustainable for the marathon distance. And I think that
what was the lactate number that you were shooting? Was it 2.4?
Yeah, somewhere in that ballpark.
Yeah.
Because we know that roughly 2 or under is resting, and about 2.5 is sustainable for the marathon distance, where you're not going to be utilizing too much carbohydrate, and you're going to be getting that optimal fuel mixture of fat and carbohydrate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because we were doing that in 2006, and then now people are like just now discovering the word lactate.
Yeah, and that kind of blows my mind, and in some ways,
it shows you how like far behind like general Westerners are with some of this stuff, like versus what some of the Africans were doing.
I think we were on the cutting edge. I mean, I think that I had some influences that kind of pushed me in that direction, and I was fortunate enough to get a lactate meter, and I had willing and able subjects to test it on.
Willing and able.
We did a lot of testing, and I think it was useful. The funny thing is, despite the fact that the lactate testing and the precision of that is kind of in vogue right now, I've kind of shifted away from that kind of objectivity. And like with my high school athletes that I coach currently, I kind of intuitively, by watching them do sessions, can tell when they've hit the sweet spot.
This to me is easily the most annoying situation right now with distance running is when I'm talking to athletes that are looking to do the double thresholds and that kind of work. They are, so it's funny you're saying this, because when you look at what the Norwegians were doing, they used lactate early on to hone in on perceived exertion. And so the coaches, by visualization, would watch the athletes, and then the athletes would take a consensus within their heads on perceived exertion. And then they would basically kind of put all that together to eventually come to a conclusion on like what their internal chemistry is at any given time. And they would do this over years, and they trained the athletes to do this. So then they eventually got to the point where they didn't have to do the testing constantly. It became an art, right? It moved away from the science and it became an art. So in a little microcosm, and that's sort of how they did it. Well, now here in the US, so many people are doing that style of training, like the double thresholds and things like that, but they didn't start with the science, and then they didn't match it with the perceived exertion. And then so they don't actually know what their internal chemistry is because they literally had no objective variable to start with. And it's just so fascinating to see this fleshing out, because me as a provider, I'm seeing like injuries being changed based on these demands, and I'm not seeing a huge thrust forward with performance. It's not like all the local runners that are doing this are like running out of their minds. It's not the case, actually. I would say that nobody's running faster than even our guys were back in the day.
Yeah.
It's crazy, like locally. So it hasn't really even worked in that way. And I think it's because they're not getting a true state of what the internal chemistry is, and then working back from that.
Well, but most of these athletes probably are developmentally not at a point where they necessitate a double threshold type session. I mean, they haven't even maxed out or optimized what a single threshold session would generate. And, they're trying to double up. And in most instances, they're probably overtraining.
Yeah.
And they're probably overshooting, what the paces are.
Yeah. Yeah. Because most of us would. Yeah. Because if you really read your internal chemistry, right, like, obviously all of us want to run faster, but if you're really reading it right, there's going to be days where you just will run slower. Like so many times, like I would run, and I think this is one of the reasons why our relationship worked so well over the years, is that I would come back from a tempo effort And like, if I needed to go to the well, I'd go to the well, but I knew in a tempo, you don't do that. Like there's
Yeah.
a certain, so if I had to dig too deep, then I knew to back off because it just wasn't my day to hit that time. Some days like your just sleep is off a little bit, or maybe something you ate is off. So usually your tempo might sit at like 5 flat. Well, that day might be 505 and it's fine. You can't let it, affect your psyche, and you kind of just have to roll with it.
Well, you were one of those unique athletes who intuitively, uh, could sense how hard to work, and your ego did not require
Yeah.
that you go out there and break new ground in every session.
Yeah, and I feel like this is something I keep consistently saying on this podcast, because I think that is something that ends up with so many people on my table with injuries and overtraining and fatigue, because they're trying to use the work to get their confidence rather than being confident, and then before you even do the work.
Well, you have to really conceptually understand what these thresholds mean to be able to implement them properly. And your typical high school runner, even if they're highly motivated and have done some reading, they're not going to be able to really hone in on those paces independently.
Yeah.
Without a coach who understands the science and how to apply it
Yeah.
adequately.
So what's one of the easiest, the key thing, the most fundamental thing that you would tell any athlete or coach that they really need to hone in on and work on to get them to the next level, to really just kind of isolate their training and get the most bang for their buck?
Well, consistency is number one. Uh, it doesn't matter, what kind of training you're doing. If you're not consistent and you're able to put together long periods of relatively injury-free, uninterrupted training, you're not going to progress. Um, Patience is key. I think that learning to slow down on the recovery days. There are a lot of highly motivated runners run much too fast on their general aerobic days, and look long term.
So what would that do? Like say
Well,
somebody, you just get somebody, they're just hammering on easy days. What is that? Why is that bad?
well, neurologically, you're not going to recover day to day. Glycolytically, you're not going to be able to replace that carbohydrate day to day if you're always tapping into that fuel source. I think you're going to just be a lot more injury prone if you're running too hard. The impact stress is too great on a daily basis. There's not adequate recovery, both muscularly, neurologically. Then you're just not optimizing the adaptive process.
So what if somebody is like highly motivated and they just are like willing to do whatever it takes to like get to the next level, and they just want to train hard and just like get after it? But we all kind of know in the back of our head that, like you said, there needs to be patience, and you need to have like kind of the long picture and that kind of thing. So how do you let them get that out of their system?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I myself was a notorious overtrainer. I was a victim of my own obsession and motivation. I think number one is they have to trust. I mean, if they have a coach, they need to trust the coach. I mean, the coach may not have all the answers all the time, but they need to be willing to put their trust in somebody else who's objective and can look at what they're doing from the outside.
Yeah.
I think that, results bring confidence. If an athlete is having positive results and recognizing that by being patient, not wanting the immediate, home run, so to speak, then inevitably, they'll accept that reality that, they need to kind of cool their jets at times.
Yeah. So I always kind of consider myself later in my career. I wasn't always this way, like even through high school and college, but later in my career, I realized that like I was the kind of runner where I would underperform in workouts often. It would be just kind of blah workouts. If you looked at them on paper, you're like, okay, that's whatever, just kind of a somewhat impressive workout. But then, relative to my races, I would over compete. I would be able to perform more beyond what you would see on paper with my workouts. And one of the things that I think kind of helped with that was the ability to, because there was times in our training where you would give me workouts that were just like really difficult. And I got used to like having to like work my week in such a way that if I needed to show up for that workout and make it count, I needed to make sure that I was recovering. I needed to make sure I was doing all the other things right. And that psychologically got me into the point where you know how to perform when it's time to perform. So like when you watch the Olympics coming up in a couple weeks, it's like, well, how do these athletes perform at their best at that moment? Well, they were training in such a way where they knew that when the time is right, they go and then they pull the trigger and go. And so many people have watered down performances because they're always trying to go.
Yeah.
And they don't understand that that's not how it works. Like you can't play basketball at a high level and be LeBron every day of the week. Like you just can't do that. Like, so even LeBron, like if you follow a 7-game series, he's going to have a game 3 where he's going to lay an egg and score 15 points, but then he's going to have a game 5 where he scores 50 points. Like that's just the way it goes. And, and that's the same way in training. It's like to have those consistent 50-point games on race day, you have to be adequately mentally prepared and physically prepared. And oftentimes people aren't putting themselves in that position.
Yeah, I think, with you specifically, you had the maturity and the patience to know, when to push, when to go easy. You took it easy on the recovery days. You didn't need to be running, 6-minute pace on a recovery day, to know that you were progressing.
Yeah.
And I think that, I still remember, I don't remember exactly the time frame or the performance, but you indicated to me that you didn't need a lot of high intensity VO2 max type sessions.
Mhm.
Like if we were training 3K or 5K,
Yeah.
you didn't need to have those blazing, 1,000-meter sessions or 800-meter repeats that you could do very well off from principally threshold type work, and that was something, that you educated me in a lot of ways by indicating that to me. And I think that, that kind of influenced my overall approach with a number of different athletes.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes back to, reading the athlete, from a coaching perspective, but also it's like the athlete understanding their strengths and their weaknesses. And then really ultimately the only person that can figure that out is the athlete. And it takes some self-reflection. And it's like I kind of just sat back one day and I just realized like no matter what the race is, I can close into 60. I can do that. I can handle that. If it's a good or bad race, like for some reason I could just kind of pull that out. And so I knew that I needed to get to that point in an adequate position. And the only way to do that was to build the bulk of the strength in the middle of the race, the meat of the race.
Yeah.
And it's like that's where my weakness was that long chemistry of the race, the 12 minutes of the 5K that just is not the start, not the finish, but it's the middle.
Well, and that's where this threshold emphasis is really having its biggest impact.
Mhm.
Is, there's a big middle ground between that easy aerobic running and that VO2 max intensity. And I think coaches, physiologists, and athletes are strengthening that middle ground more than, the old paradigm was you put in a ton of easy miles, then you did these very high intensity interval sessions at race pace or faster.
It's kind of like Wetmore kind of stuff.
But the new paradigm is filling in that big middle ground and strengthening the power of that middle ground, and that's what the threshold sessions, I think, are really accomplishing.
Are you impressed with the current state of American distance running?
I think we have good depth. I think we have good depth. I mean, when I heard or saw that the Olympic standard for the 10,000 was going to be 27 flat, I had my misgivings about what the effect of that would be. But the athletes have risen to the challenge. And yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the recent trials and you look at, some of these collegiate performances, we have depth that's just unheard of, from previous eras.
Yeah, for sure. The depth is insane. And I would attribute that to kind of the, training, sort of the coaches figuring out sort of the meat of it. But also, I would also say, like, even think back to, like, 2007, 2006 era, like, we didn't even have, like, a provider like me didn't even exist. Like, the current practice that I run was actually not really even a thing.
Yeah.
And so there's been so many more modalities and, like, Normatec and, like, cryo chambers and all these things to just, like, help bolster the masses and keep the masses healthier. And so in a way, like, I'm a bit skeptical of the current state of American distance running, because I think that a lot of our depth is not just the result of training, and it's mostly the result of, like, the general infrastructure of sports med just kind of working to keep a lot of these athletes healthy and getting them to the next level, because there's this nice blend of, like, performance modalities where, I just showed you, like, PEMF devices. It's like now people are doing, like, peptide infusions, all sorts of stuff. It's like all these things are just coming out to just, like, emblazon recovery and just help that so much more in that era. But then I look to, like, races that require genuine, like, grit, like the 10K or the marathon. And in the marathon, we're abysmal right now.
Yeah.
So why is there such a fall off of, like, the 15 to the marathon? Like, what is that?
Well, I think that a lot of these guys, um, that have the requisite talent are either, waiting to run the marathon, or, um, they're so intimidated by what the Africans have put out there. When the standard is basically 202 to 204 and we're back at 210, 212, um, you know, racing 26.2 miles is a scary proposition.
Yeah.
And, I just don't think we're wired to have that fearlessness that you see amongst some of the African runners.
God, that's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant, because I know I was talking to Kevin Hansen and this past weekend, and we were talking about, like, his top athlete and how they're kind of getting ready to go 207, and I was like, when's 204 coming? For us, when's another 203, 204 coming? Not another, but when is it coming? And he just smiles and kind of, like, chuckles, and it just falls flat. It's like, we don't have answers right now. I mean, Brazilians have, like, what, 3, 4 guys that can go under right around 204 right now? It's like, it's crazy that we're
Yeah,
just so far behind right now.
the depth worldwide is phenomenal. And yeah, there's a lot of guys from all over the world, Europe and South America, that particularly Japan,
Yeah.
that are relative no names, but have run these times that no American currently can really think of. And Rupp was supposed to be the great hope, and
Yeah.
he kind of stalled out, and maybe Connor Mance or somebody like that gets there. But you have to have that requisite sub 27 10,000 meter capability,
Mhm.
and probably 13 flat capability, and definitely be able to break 1 hour. And kind of the crazy thing is, you look at what Ryan Hall did when he set the American record,
Yeah.
and how long it's taken. Basically nobody has bettered that.
Yeah.
And we should routinely have guys running sub 1 hour, but we don't. you
Hmm.
know and until we can do that, there's really no hope of running 204, 205.
Yeah. Hmm. Is max VO2 important?
It's important as a physiological variable, but I'm not convinced that knowing your max VO2 is
Yeah.
super critical.
Yeah.
I think that it's a data point. It's kind of a moving target. It's one physiological component, but it's not the end all be all.
Can you improve it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can improve it up to a point, but then I think there's a ceiling. And then from there, other factors come into play to create the performance.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I always appreciated about the way you did physiology testing, when you get the mask on, you do the max VO2 testing and all that is, you get all the data points and then, you break them down. You go, okay, so we have the max VO2, we have the anaerobic threshold, we have the aerobic threshold, we have the, and then we have like the lactate, tolerance, like where their peak lactate. And then you have all these other variables associated with that. What are the lactate numbers? What are the heart rate numbers, associated with all that? What are their obvious paces? And then it's like, you take this idea of like all ships rise with the tide, and it's like you find kind of this number that doesn't match the other ones.
Yeah.
And when people kind of have their watches and they're like, oh, my max VO2 is this, and then it says I should be able to run this time, and it's like, that's obviously a good shot in the dark, but it really is just a shot in the dark. And then now with the lactate stuff coming about, it's like that's also a shot in the dark, but maybe a little bit closer shot than the max VO2. It's like, it behooves people to get tested adequately to be able to figure out all these numbers, but also not just somebody to, a lot of times when you go and get like a max VO2 test, you're coming out with like a couple numbers but it's really like how you got to that max number. That's the critical thing. And most people come out of these tests with just the max number and not all the other chemistry around it.
Yeah. Well, an athlete gets tested or a recreational runner gets tested and they think, okay, now I got all the answers. That's just a moment in time. It's a moving target, and how you implement the training based on those numbers and where you go from there, and more of a long range extrapolation of applying that data is critical. In our best instances, we had one athlete, and you would know him, that we tested 4 times in a year, Chris Fallon,
Okay.
from Copland. And he was the only athlete that we ever had that, him and his coach totally bought into long-term testing and repeated testing. And, we tested him 4 times over the course of a year.
Yeah.
And there were variations in the results in each of those tests. And when, he was performing well and was healthy, the numbers reflected it. And when a couple instances where he was having some difficulties, the numbers also reflected that.
Yeah.
So there was a case where we had a very close relationship with the coach, and he accepted our advisement on how to approach things based on the results, and it all worked out well. And when you look at elite athletes, when they go to the Olympic Training Center, doesn't matter what country it is, that's how it works. But an individual just looking to improve their performance, to be a recreational runner, they really have to commit to what those results indicate and have a definite blueprint for what to do going forward. So,
yeah, I remember sitting on some of those testings with the Team USA California in 2006 with watching Ryan Shea and Dina and Meb and all them getting tested and all that. And, how you were doing it in your lab was pretty much the same as how Mark Shannon was doing it out there. Pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, I was heavily influenced by, guys like Jack Daniels and when I was going through college and when I was younger, I wanted to be a physiologist. I wanted to be an applied exercise physiologist, and I wanted to do that max testing and be part of that. And I was very motivated by the science, and fortunately, I got to do a lot of that type of thing, and it was fun.
So what do you think as a general, kind of a 10,000 foot view, what do you think is some of the coaches, whether it be high school or college, are doing wrong these days that you wish that they would kind of change or hadn't changed?
Well, anecdotally anyways, I haven't met anybody at the high school level that's trying to implement double threshold sessions. I think that one of the biggest mistakes, within maybe the high school or collegiate ranks is too great of an awareness of what everybody's doing based on the internet. And, you get these runners and they become obsessed with trying to figure out what their performances are. And basically, they have a very preconceived idea of the pecking order before they go into almost every race. So I'm constantly fighting, that. But, I still think that motivation is a challenge for the typical high school coach, particularly finding, those athletes who are motivated, disciplined, and committed long-term and are not overly involved in so many different activities that the running is just another thing that they do. Mileage wise, I think that most high school runners probably don't do enough mileage overall. We're seeing unparalleled depth at the high school level. You go to Arcadia Invitational and there's 40 guys running under 9 minutes, which is unbelievable. But at the same time, here in Ohio, I don't think that, we've seen this burgeoning of performances really.
Yeah, going back to the arms race of the internet, it's I remember in 2003, so I started in college in 2001, I'm alone, and graduated in 06. And then I remember the class of 03 recruiting them, which was like Chris Inick and Robinson and all of them. I remember they came in and recruits prior to that would be like, oh, I'm running like 20, 30 miles a week. And then after like running dash log came on, do you remember that?
Yeah.
So, then all of a sudden we started to hear kids coming in, oh, I'm running like 70, 80 miles a week. So like, I don't know if they were saying that to like try to impress us, but either way, like they were like looking at what their competitors were doing. And like, it was like a clear inflection point where now online running logs came on and then it was just an arms race.
Yeah. And I think you see that. I mean, the Strava impacts what runners feel compelled to do. And, I'm glad I didn't have that type of thing when I was competing and so forth, because, we already had enough of a sense of what the competitors and the top runners were doing. And having that constant comparison would have kind of probably.
So you had enough of a sense. So, back in the 80s, like how did you know what your competitors were doing?
Just by talking to them.
Yeah. Just cooling down and just chilling.
Actually talking to people. We'd wait all month for track and field news to come out, or, they had this Ohio track and field news, which was just a 4-page newspaper type thing that had, the top high school times in each division. And that came out maybe every week or two during the season. And there was not this instantaneous, you weren't looking at results on your phone on the way home from a meet. I it was a simpler time.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely agree with that. So what do you think coaches are doing right these days?
That's a tough question. I think that your
the internal cynic of
your average high school coach is much more knowledgeable than they were in the past.
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to get anybody having their kids run, 10 by 200 meters every day, during cross country.
Yeah.
I think that your average coach has I think coaches are better from the standpoint that most of them have been runners. I think that most of them competed at a fairly, competitive level. And, a lot of them are highly motivated to be knowledgeable. And also, the state requires a coaching certification. So you have to have a general knowledge of physiology and first aid and these types of things.
Yeah.
And so I think the overall quality of coaching within the high school ranks is definitely better than it was like when I would have been in school.
This is maybe a little bit of a sidestep, but I personally feel like one of the issues with current coaching is a lack of inspiration. And I feel like they're more educated. I think they've leaned too much into the science and less into the inspiration side of it.
I would agree.
I mean, it's really emotion that gets people to run through a brick wall, and very few coaches genuinely inspire their athletes. And I see this all the time with my clients, and they come out with all the hard science and they talk the talk, and then it's like in the end, a lot of runners won't trust their coach because they don't get a sense of caring. They don't get a sense of like true inspiration and belief, and they just kind of feel flat. And I think that kind of goes back to your point of like, runners not being fully focused on running.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of coaches, they're afraid to push the kids too much.
Yeah.
I think that, the kids, they kind of shape the atmosphere in a lot of respects. I'm constantly battling all the other involvements that the kids have, and it's a very rare kid who, is just passionate and immersed in running, and really wants to make it their life, and wants to think big and go as far as they can. And there's some that say they do, but whether they really put it into action, that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah, one of the unique strategies that you used on me was and I don't know if you figured this out like later and after years of working together, but I remember the only reason, pretty much one of the only reasons, and I think I've told you this before, that I got to the Olympic trials in 12 was our conversation prior to me going to chiropractic school. So basically in 2000, I ran my debut marathon in 2006. I missed the 2008 Olympic trial standard by 29 seconds. So the standard then was the B standard was 2:22. So I ran 2:22:29. And then I pretty much stopped running marathons. At that time, I just was kind of moving on to the road and some other stuff. But I was like, I gotta move on with my life, right? Shit or get off the pot. So I went to chiropractic school in 07. And then I remember right when I went down, like right when I left, you were like, well, that's pretty much the end of your running career.
Yeah, I mean,
I understand why you said that, because it was definitely, I was going full time into school, and I was getting a master's at the same time as a doctorate, and I was working, doing all this stuff. But what was interesting to that, if you hadn't actually said that to me, which most people would have just been like, whatever, screw you. If you hadn't actually said that to me, which is not how I took it, by the way, I was like, I took it as a challenge. It was like, oh no, it's not the end of my running. It's just not, because I don't want it to be. So then I had that injury in 08 because I was like the fittest I'd ever been, and I was getting ready for the US cross jams, and like the week before I tore my plantar fascia. So then I had that injury, and it took me pretty much close to 2 years to get back to even run. And I was on and off, I'd be healthy for a month, but then it was late 2009 that I was actually able to start running again. And then that pretty much single-handedly like inspired me to train from 2010 to the trials in 12. Was to just like, I need to kind of see if I can still get it to the next level. And then they lowered the standard 3 minutes, and I still made it, which was pretty funny.
Well,
So that's like reading your athlete right there.
I'm glad you weren't discouraged by.
But see, that's the thing, is like you mentioned earlier. That's why I bring up the story, is like most coaches are afraid to challenge their athletes. And that was essentially a challenge, and it's like if somebody's legitimately up for the challenge, like that's why I love the world of like UFC, and love the world of like where people are still allowed to challenge their athletes. Like it's fun to see still.
Yeah.
But in so many arenas, we have sort of nerfed everything up that we can't actually challenge people anymore. And I ultimately think that's why we're good in the mile, but we're bad in the marathon, because you need a gritty person. You need a rough person that can go to the well, like real, like a Salazar kind of person that can genuinely go to the well. And we just don't have that in modern America, or we just haven't found them yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you you look at the current crop of guys who are running, sub 1320, sub 2740, that in theory we should have people that have that capability to run at that elite level in the marathon. But it takes a complete dedication. I mean, how many guys are really willing to sacrifice on that level and put the rest of their life on hold, and you know there's some people that had a huge influence on American distance running who maybe are not as actively coaching as they were. Joe Vigil, for instance, he was very instrumental in what Keflezighi and Dina did, and but things have made such a quantum leap. And I wasn't a big fan of the whole breaking two hype. I thought that it was a very kind of contrived experiment, and
well, it made Nike a lot of money, so it worked for them.
And this guy who recently died, Kiptum, who was legitimately going to try to go for it in Rotterdam. Who knows? Maybe he would have done it, but it certainly inspired a lot of people to shoot for a higher level, and the world standard is more 201, 203 now, and we're floundering back at 208, 210.
I brought up this book here, the Sports Gene by David Epstein, and this quote here, just in this, so it's a chapter. It's so it's called "Can Every Kalenjin Run," which is basically a tribe in Kenya. And at the very last paragraph, a track and field statistician, Peter Matthews, talks about like the critique of like the current modern day Western runner. And he writes, "In these days of computer games, sedentary pursuits, and driving our children to school, it is the hungry fighter or the poor peasant who has the endurance background and the incentive to work on it who makes the top distance runner." And I was like, that is amazing that he said that, because he put into words pretty much why, like the average American doesn't need to run.
That's true.
But the average Kenyan Kalenjin member, which that's what that chapter is about, if they want to get off their property and they want to make a living for themselves, they have to run. Like they have that's one of their ways of doing it. And it's a survival thing. And so that is what sends them into this deep frenzy of being able to dig so much deeper than the average person that doesn't actually need it. So I think that's such an interesting thought. And I was like, I couldn't believe he actually wrote it.
Yeah. I mean, there's always been this discussion as to, what gives the African runners the advantage, or is there a genetic difference and so forth. And I think that fundamentally that need, that sense of survival probably does come into play very much. And we have way too many options in life, and maybe if you're in Africa and you see other people running at a high level, maybe you think
it's your way out.
I can do that, and it can change their life instantly. I mean, you win a major marathon, and it's an instant life changer.
Yeah, 100%. I know. And then we were just talking about a local runner who was at the trials, and are they going to keep going? And some people are saying no, some people are saying yeah, and it's like that's the point, right? It's like if you needed to make money for your family and to buy a farm and to change your life, like you'll obviously just keep going. But if you don't have to do any of that, then you'll probably just go work another job.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, a lot of times, having that supportive family backing and so forth is critical. But many times, these African runners, their parents don't necessarily want them to run. They'll say, why are you wasting your time? You should be, a farmer, or you should be working on your education. So it's not like, they have a perfect setup.
There was that on one day on Let's Run, they had a quote from about Kiptum. It was actually before he passed, and it was before he ran Chicago. His uncle was recalling the story about how Kelvin had told him he wanted to run. And then the uncle was like, no, we as a family don't think you should do that. We think you should just stay an electrician, because I think he was an electrician or something.
Yeah, something like that.
And then this was like when he was 19. And he's like, no, I really feel like I want to run. And they're like, no, we as a family have decided that you should stay an electrician. And then he goes, and besides, you don't have any shoes. And then Calvin's like, well, I'll find some, because I think somebody in the village has shoes. And then that was the end of the discussion. And then he ended up running. And then he ended up running the world record. It's like crazy that, like, what, 3 years prior to that, that was his conversation. His family was like actually trying to talk him out of it. And then he just goes, it's nuts.
I mean, even, Haile Gebrselassie, I mean, his dad was not really supportive and in favor of
I didn't know that.
And, that's an excellent movie. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's called Endurance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of a biographical type movie that Disney put out about Haile Gebrselassie, and he actually appears in the movie. He plays himself.
That's cool.
But it's a pretty interesting movie.
All right, so as we're kind of coming close to our time here, any last little tidbits you feel like people should know with regards to training, or anything that you think would be some good last parting words for any listeners?
Well, I think every runner, number one, needs to enjoy the training process. I mean, you got to have a genuine love, or at least liking, to get out there every day and put in the time and be committed long term. And I think every runner needs to find a training environment of which they make their own.
Mm-hmm.
The roads they run on, the trails they run on. That's part of their running identity.
Yeah.
And you need to make it your own. And also, don't be too dogmatic about coaching science or exercise physiology. There's a lot of things about running success that we don't actually know why they work. But, by having, faith and confidence in the process, and having an approach that you believe in, I think every runner can have success. So it's very individualistic. There is no one size fits all, and it's really a function of what you believe in as an athlete, and even as a coach. We get too caught up in the dogma of coaching.
It's fascinating, because I remember in Grandma's in 2011, when I ran my second marathon and ran 2:18:11 or whatever to qualify for the trials. I remember leading into that, I really honed in on this, because I didn't have a lot of time. I was a new doctor. I just graduated, and I just was like really maximizing my time for training. But what I thought to myself was, the moments that I do get to train, I will focus intensely on visualization and locking in on the belief of running that fast. And I remember I had this like mentality of like trying to, at any given point, touch on a 5:12 pace, and just feeling that rhythm and just making it so comfortable and pleasant that I could just like run it all day long. When I was lifting weights, when I was doing core, I would just set into my mind what it would be like if I qualified, what it would be like at mile 20, what it would be like when I'm going up the hill at 22 at Lemon Drop Hill. Like, I kind of worked my psyche into all this and the belief. Well, I remember, I don't know if I ever told you this. Did I ever tell you how this worked during that race at mile 8?
I don't think so.
So leading into that race, I had an Achilles tendonitis. Remember, we were going to pull the plug on the race. And then it flared up on like that Tuesday, and the race was a Saturday race. I think it was a Saturday race. And so I'm like, I don't know, I'm going to go out. You're like, let's wait, let's back out. We'll do Cal International later in the year. That was our plan. But then at the last minute, I was like, no, they're going to fly me up there anyway, so I might as well just go. And then I ran the day before and I was like, dude, I think my Achilles is fine. I think I'm going. And so then I start the race. So basically I say all that because that week I kind of was like not mentally prepared to run the marathon that week because my Achilles was flared up. So I thought I was backing out actually. And at the last minute I was into it. So the race starts and I'm not mentally there. I'm not like locked in. I'm like, okay, I guess I'm doing this today. And I get to like mile 8 and I'm like, I don't want to do this anymore. I literally had this thought that just floated in my head was like, I really don't want to go to the well today. And then I literally negotiated with myself. It was like, have an angel and a demon on one shoulder or whatever. And it was like, I literally thought to myself, all right, if you run 1 mile over 5:20, just drop out. And then the next like 12 miles or some crazy number, like I literally ran 5:12 on the dot. And if you look at my splits, it's so weird. I literally ran 5:12, 5:12. And I remember laughing at like mile 14 or 15. And I'm like, dude, I can't even sabotage myself today because I had worked so much in my psyche, that pace and that visualization that it was just like my subconscious was like, dude, you're doing this today. Like it's happening. And I really feel like when you hear crazy stories like a Billy Mills winning the 10,000, like stuff like that, it's like, that's probably what they did. They probably just, nobody in that 10,000 that day believed it more than him. And when it came down to the wire and it's an alley fight, he survives because he's the one that really believed it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody can fully get into an athlete's head and really know exactly what they're thinking. And, and every athlete has to have those tools that they use to make it worth it to themselves. I
remember talking with Megan Featherstone. So she was on the podcast a couple weeks ago, and she was talking about because she met both Kiptum and Kipchoge, and she said when she met Kipchoge, he was calm. He was just like very relaxed, very chill. And then when she met Kiptum, she said he was frenetic and he was looking around like crazy, and he was like, he couldn't sit down for any given time. Like he was just like, he was a young dude that just was loaded with energy. Yeah. And I would love to like know the psychology of like Kiptum versus a Kipchoge and where they were at when they were running their fastest psychologically, because they came at it from two completely different sides of the coin.
Well, historically runners, have been known to be introverts, so to speak. And, kind of, there's a certain perception of what the runner's psyche is, but, runners are like normal people. They come in all different temperaments and personalities. And, I don't think there's just one successful running temperament, really.
Correct. Yeah. All right. Well, I felt like this was a great episode, and it meant a lot for me for you to come up here and do the podcast. And I feel like we covered a lot of really great topics, and we hope to have you on soon. So thanks again for coming, and
thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And be sure to like and subscribe the show, and be sure to give us some feedback on some of the topics we covered, and shoot over some topics that you'd like to see us cover in the future. So thanks again for joining us. All the best.